Thank you for joining me for another 10 minutes in the Word. And we're taking one more look at the warning in Hebrews 3:12 to 4:1, which is part of the second main point of this sermon, where the preacher has been teaching the superiority of the apostleship of Christ, especially in comparison with Moses. And he's using Psalm 95 as the textual basis of his warning, drawing lessons from the story of the disobedience of the Israelites in the wilderness. Now, there are three admonitions in these verses, and we've looked at the first two so far. So in chapter 3, verse 12, there was take care, and in verse 13, exhort one another every day. And today we look at 4:1. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Commentators and preachers are generally divided as to whether this verse rounds off the warning or whether it introduces the next part of teaching that runs through to verse 13. And actually, though I've opted for the former option, you can actually really take it either way. And I think what it does is it rounds off and presses home the warning of the previous verses, but it also opens the door to the next part of the teaching. Also, although 4:2 to 13 is a continuation of what's come before, it shifts the contrast with Jesus from Moses to Joshua, as we will shortly see. So verse 1 does two things. It reinforces the theme of taking care and exhorting one another because of the danger of falling away. And then it introduces to us the important subject of rest that dominates the next verses. So let's look at these two elements. First, our preacher builds a direct bridge between the Old Testament people that he's been drawing lessons from in Psalm 95 and the New Testament people of God to whom he is preaching. And he says that the promise of a rest still stands, and that they should be afraid in case, like their Old Testament counterparts, they be found to have fallen short and fallen away from God. So this is really an even stronger version of the previous admonitions to take care and exhort one another. Now it's be afraid. By the way, I wonder if you notice something significant and touching about the way our preacher expresses this. He doesn't point the finger lecturingly, as it were, at his congregation and set himself apart from them. He says, let us fear. In other words, no one is so advanced, no one is so mature or knowledgeable in their walk with God and their faith that they no longer need to take care or no longer need others to exhort and challenge them from time to time. It's true, all of us are vulnerable to this deception. But what about this idea of fear? Surely the Bible repeatedly tells us don't be afraid. Because, for example, perfect love casts out fear. Even elsewhere in Hebrews we're told fear is something to avoid. In 11:23 and 27, for example. But here we're told that the prospect of failing to enter the promised rest should invoke a healthy fear in our hearts. Now, the truth is that the Bible both prohibits and commands fear. And the critical difference is in the object of the fear. We're not to fear in the sense of distrusting God, but we are to fear offending him. We are to fear God himself in the sense of reverence and awe. And here, we are to fear the sin of unbelief, because that would disqualify us from entering into the rest offered us by God, and to which our preacher now turns us. So let's think about this word rest, because it's absolutely critical to our understanding of this section of this sermon. It comes 9 times in this section and nowhere else in Hebrews. So before we see how it's expounded in verses 3 to 11, let's just take a moment to get familiar with the idea of this rest. Of course, the reason the word is important here is that it comes from Psalm 95 verse 11, which our preacher is using as his base text for his warning and application. That verse reads, "As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." And it's quoted here in 3:11 and will be again in 4:3 and 5. And that phrase of "my rest" is pregnant with more than one meaning, as Hebrews 3 and 4 makes clear. Now, the biblical background for this idea actually comes from Genesis 2, where we're told that having created everything that exists in 6 literal days, God rested on the 7th day. And that Sabbath rest of God becomes a picture and a type of different rests that are then taught throughout Scripture, including here in Hebrews 3 and 4. And the first thing to stress, though, is that the word rest does not mean lack of activity. It is not a rest of idleness or inertia. Rather, when God rested on the first Sabbath, he simply ceased doing what he had been doing on the previous 6 days, because that work was complete and there was nothing more to do. However, he was far from idle. He was, as we know specifically from the New Testament, sustaining every element of the universe that he had just created by the power of his word. The same word through which he had created all things. Then, when we get to Canaan, God's rest meant the promise to his people of a life in the land he was giving them. And it was this rest that so many of the people of Israel forfeited, as Psalm 95 has made so clear. But the Bible also uses this word rest to speak of the state into which men and women come when they trust Christ for salvation. They cease from their activity of trying to make themselves right with God, and they can rest in the perfect work he has done on our behalf. Think of Jesus' words in Matthew 11:29. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find" what? "Rest for your souls." But there's more to God's rest than even that. Because as we shall see more fully in the next few verses in Hebrews, there's a further dimension to this rest that's promised to the people of God, even to those who have already come to genuine saving faith. It's the ultimate, the permanent rest of heaven and glory itself. Joshua did not lead the Israelites into the final rest of God. There is still a continuing offer and promise of rest. In other words, even the children of those who died in the wilderness entered the promised land, and this did not fulfill the ultimate entrance to rest, because a different rest remains, a rest of which Canaan is, in some senses, a type or picture. There is an eschatological aspect to God's rest, a rest not experienced by Joshua and the Israelites when they entered Canaan, and one that still remains for us to experience and enjoy as well. And it is this Sabbath rest, as the writer goes on to describe it, that still remains, that our preacher is urging his readers, including us, to experience and to pursue by faith.